Good afternoon, and good morning to our West Coast listeners and to our guest today, who's on the West Coast. Please welcome the Executive Director of Equality Labs and author of The Trauma of Caste, Thenmozhi Soundararajan.
Hey, Juan, you got it.
All right, got that right. Thenmozhi, thank you for being my guest today. Welcome to our weekly Chair Chat. So glad to have you.
Oh, glad to be here.
So, Thenmozhi, I want to kick off by asking you about your book, actually. I've actually done some research and writing around trauma in work that I do. So I'm interested in how you connect, or could you talk about the interconnectionality between trauma and caste, and kind of what is caste and how does it impact us from a traumatic perspective?
Oh, definitely. So, for listeners that are first hearing about caste for the first time, it's a system of exclusion that has its origins in South Asia. And, like race, it's based on a social fiction where it has people who are in the top caste that are seen as most spiritually pure. And then they've created graded levels of impurity and lesser professions underneath them into this hierarchy. And those of the people that are at the bottom are seen as untouchable because they're seen as spiritually defiling to other people. And so these castes face like backbreaking labor, extreme violence, and deep, deep social exclusion. And, the conditions of caste oppressed people in South Asia are really dismal. And there's a crime that happens against Dalit people, every 19 minutes. So it's a pretty severe system of exclusion that impacts 1.9 billion people, and very crucially, 5.7 million South Asian Americans. And that's really where the work of my organization, Equality Labs, really comes into play, because we have documented how extensive caste is here. And, finding that 1 in 4 people who are caste oppressed face physical or verbal assault, 1 out of 3 educational discrimination, and 2 out of 3 workplace discrimination. So in the conduction of our advocacy to stop this, grave discrimination we're seeing in workplaces and university and community institutions, trauma was super relevant, Juan, because I think what I've found in working with many civil rights lawyers is you can change the law, but you have to also change the hearts and minds. And so much of changing hearts and minds comes with people becoming aware of the conditioning of their nervous system when it comes to intergenerational harm related to systems of violence. And so some of my best mentors are folks like Resmaa Menakem, who wrote, My Grandmother's Hands, or civil rights lawyer Rhonda McGee, who has really brought mindfulness to civil rights law practices to help people understand trauma of systems of violence just aren't in the bodies of the oppressed, but it's also in the bodies of the privileged. So bringing insight and using language like trauma helps us understand how we're all really untenably holding these violent systems, and what are better ways for us to begin to hold, healing and reconciliation when we can have courageous conversation and opening around these systems of violence.
And I'm sure you are fully aware and talk about these issues from a generational perspective, how we pass down trauma.
Absolutely.
Through generations, through what happens through our families. And often we're not even aware of how we're passing this down culturally and socially through generations, because these issues are historic, right?
Yeah. And that's really another piece that I speak about in the book, because, Indigenous thinkers who really talk about, the trauma of, genocide and Indigenous genocide, they use this term called the soul wound. And this came from Eduardo Duran's work. And that idea is that a pain in one person isn't just their individual lifetime experience. It's the pain of their lineage related to historical violence.
That's right.
So for Black folks, it might be the pain of enslavement. But for Dalit people and for South Asians, our soul wound is that of caste. And it's something that there's such a deep taboo to talk about. we carry tremendous, tremendous grief and guilt and other complex feelings as to how we may have been on both sides of those divides.
Right.
And my hope with this book was to help people feel more comfortable, more at ease, to
Right.
start to look at that wound, but also begin to tend to it and to heal it and bring reconciliation, both by civil rights remedies, but also by courageous conversation and tenderness towards each other.
Right. So this is Della History Month,
Yes,
and
it
you are one
is.
of the founders of Della History Month. I believe
That's
you
right.
started this project, or it became official in 2015. As you also know, we are 2 months from, past rather, Black History Month. Could you connect the historical caste system in the Della community with the African American struggle here in the United States? Are there some commonalities? Are they similar? Are they different? But kind of tell us more about the historical caste system in the community.
Well, I think one thing that's really important to know is that there's caste as the social phenomenon in South Asia.
Right.
And then there's the recognition that caste systems exist across many cultures. And in fact, in intergovernmental law, the International, Convention Against Racism and Discrimination, it speaks in Article 29 that underneath discrimination against racism is discrimination based on descent and work and birth, which covers people who are traditionally from the South Asian caste system, but all societies that experience discrimination based on birth. And in that capacity, I think that we've seen a whole tradition of Black internationalism that has reached out to other oppressed communities, including Dalit communities, to try to be able to both theorize what is the violence that we're experiencing under white supremacy here in the United States, and what are oppressed communities that we can build mutual solidarities of liberation. And from a legal perspective, I think the work of Professor Kevin Brown is so crucial here, because as a legal scholar, he is one of the first, legal scholars to do comparative Black and Dalit research in terms of civil rights.
Right.
And what we saw is that in the development of racial civil rights law, Black abolitionists were seeking language to describe this theory of race. And what they did is they borrowed a lot of language about caste. And so from those early debates in the 1800s all the way to Plessy versus Ferguson, you see race being described as racial caste. And the debates often go back and forth, talking about and referring to the Indian caste system. So in many ways, we have a unique foundation for the addition of caste as a protected category in the United States because of that really rich Black civil rights legal tradition. But I think outside of the law, there have been many times where Black and Dalit people have seen and exchanged and interacted with each other. So for example, Dr. Ambedkar and W.E.B. Du Bois had a very powerful exchange about the power of, doing advocacy around racial civil rights and Dalit or caste civil rights at the League of Nations, the forerunner of the UN. And of course, there was also the Black Panthers and the Dalit Panthers that were also informed by those strategies. So I think oppressed people everywhere always try to find each other. They try to find meaning with each other. And that tradition of internationalism is really potent when we're in communication with each other. And I think about the work of Isabel Wilkerson and how she has really, brought this conversation about how anti-Blackness and the formation of Jim Crow was part of the development of the caste system here, and connecting it with other global caste systems, including the original one. So we are in a rich time of the theorizing of global caste theory. And, I think it's a time when really oppressed people are speaking with each other without intermediaries. And it's very powerful.
Right. Isabel Wilkerson's book really connects, like you said, the story here in America with the caste system in India and South Africa. Powerful work that I really encourage everyone to read if you have not. It's called Caste. We're talking about these concepts and this struggle a lot from a group and personal perspective, the impact it has on people. But as you well know, the work you've been working and the work you continue to do is also trying to impact public policy. which is critically important, particularly for lawyers, to be engaged in the policy and legal structures that uphold these caste systems. Could you share with us some of the current or recent wins that you have enjoyed as an organization in Seattle, and also talk about some of the work you're doing right now in California?
Absolutely. So, Equality Labs is a Dalit or caste oppressed civil rights organization that works on these questions of caste and gender and racial equity. And one of our core campaigns has been to have every American institution add caste as a protected category because of the grave discrimination that we're seeing. And, we're hearing of workers describing conditions that include wage theft, trafficking, sexual harassment, demotion, and termination. And we have several prominent legal cases as a result, including the state of California suing the Cisco Corporation for casteism, which is a first in American civil rights. And we also have the Baptist Temple case, where you have hundreds of workers that were trafficked to build religious institutions across the country. So in the wake of these cases, Dalit civil rights organizers around the United States have said, we need safer workplaces, we need universities to be safe, and we've added caste as a protected category as a civil rights demand. And luckily, we're being met by so many amazing institutions. So, we've had the Cal State University system, one of the largest public university systems in the world, add caste as a protected category, spearheading work at Harvard University and Brown University. And we just won in Seattle, the first city to add caste as a protected category. And now we're launching this powerful statewide campaign with, California State Senator Aisha Wahab, one of the first Muslim senators in the California legislature, to add this bill called SB 403 to end caste discrimination. And it essentially makes current protections for caste explicit, while also making it an explicitly protected category. And if we win, it would make California first in the nation as a state to kind of drive this conversation across the country. And it's really an amazing thing to happen, because I grew up in California. I've seen caste in all the domains of my life, from K through 12 education to universities to supporting workers across many different industries. And I'm just thrilled to see this movement grow in such a powerful way.
Well, this may be a way where the American Bar Association could be of assistance. Once we adopt this as a policy internally, it gives us the opportunity then to promote and advocate for the change in state and federal law to add caste as a protected class in discrimination cases. So we would love to continue that discussion with you to figure out ways that we could partner with you to advance that around the country.
Oh, that's so important, Juan, because there is so much political violence that our
Yes.
movement and the politicians and electeds that work on this issue. Like State Senator Aisha Wahab's office faced threats to their staff. They had people physically come in and accost their team. They called them Islamophobic and racist, slurs. Our team, like last year, when I was, this time, this very month in Dalit History Month, I was supposed to speak at Google and deplatformed by bigots inside the company. And I had to live in a safe house for 2 months.
What?
Yes, what? Because these bigots were so threatened by the discussion of caste. In fact, what they said was, I'm afraid for my life if the speaker were to speak. And as far as I know, Juan, no one has ever died from a DEI talk. And yet,
And these were employees of Google?
Yes, yes. And it was really interesting because the way that this out is the manager who was, had brought in and was trying to celebrate Dalit History Month. She publicly resigned because she faced retaliation. Her name is Thenmozhi Gupta, for organizing around caste and talking about what happened. And then we came out publicly about how much violence we faced, and the company asserted that caste was not a protected category. That's why the change is so important, because we have companies who are unlawfully choosing when to protect workers and when not to protect workers. And we can't have that, you know?
No, your experience prompts me to ask you, what do you say in response to this now, not even subvert, it's overt, this overt resistance to education, education around Black history, diverse communities' histories, this notion that people will be uncomfortable by learning certain truths about our country or even the world globally. I guess we're now seeing this in corporate America. I read an article a few weeks ago that there is a pushback and a first terminated or first fired in the DEI space in corporate America. So when companies are cutting back because of the economy, the first department that gets trimmed often are these DEI departments or DEI employees. Do you have any thoughts around that or ways we can respond?
Well, I think, going back to our first questions, this is part of the reason why I wanted to explore systems of exclusion through the lens of trauma, because
Right,
when you read the work of Resmaa Menakem and when you read the work of Ruth King and Rhonda McGee, all these like Black Buddhists and somatic abolitionists, they really give you insight into the mindset of the fragile and the bigoted, because again, discomfort is not the same as grave discrimination.
that's
And
right,
yet we're slowing the pace of progress because of the discomfort of the privileged.
right,
And that you can't solve with the law. You
right,
have to solve through these other modes of de-escalation and self-awareness and networks of trusted allies who can de-escalate their bigoted relatives and friends. That's really this moment of polarization that we have to really take apart and start to de-escalate, because you have these absurd laws that are happening in places like Tennessee and Florida, where they're blacking, they're blocking Black scholars and trying to erase history, because like in Tennessee, white children will be traumatized if they're taught the history of slavery.
right.
Right.
And they're pretending as though being uncomfortable or having discomfort is traumatic.
Exactly. Exactly.
And the science speaks overtly against that, that all discomfort is not traumatic.
Well, and that actually discomfort can be an opening to
Right,
transformation and
exactly.
reconnection. But part of what the techniques of focusing on trauma and building resilience for racial stress or caste stress is that we need to, in order for us to even be in the same dialogue, because right now, privileged people and oppressed people are in very different dialogues. You've got to be able to condition the nervous systems of the privileged to handle more stress, more caste stress, more racial stress, so that even if we're not in agreement, they can at least agree to be in the same conversation.
Right,
Right now, they're not even trying to do that. And
right,
that rebuilding of consensus is going to require some of these new techniques that aren't necessarily in the realm of law, but they come from these other modalities of somatics and, group psychology and transformative justice. But
right,
if we don't level up in those skills, we're going to be facing more polarization, more political violence,
right,
and the greater deterioration of our consensus,
right.
right?
I've got to ask you about the theme of our year for this section is around economic justice. We just came
Mhm.
off of a tremendous conversation at our Economic Justice Summit in Georgetown's law school 2 weeks ago. And I want to just get your comments on connecting your work to the work of economic justice, wealth disparity. How do these systems impact economic issues?
Well, I think that, I've been thinking a lot about that, because the coalition that we've built for SB 403, that bill to end caste in California, we have workers across many industries. We have Uber drivers, we have tech
Mhm.
workers, we have farm workers, we have people who own small businesses.
Right,
And and you have people who are in finance and education. But the thing that I've seen is that violence is such a deterrent to people being able to get their full economic capabilities, you know? And so, you know, one reality that happens for caste oppressed workers is that they're in the closet. So they're not fully connecting and networking in the ways that they should be because they're worried about being found out about their caste identity and being blackballed in terms of their networks and professional
Right.
consent. I also think similar to other BIPOC communities, you might have people who are first generation earners, but while they might be making slight improvements in income, there's still a huge wealth disparity. So in terms of who gets to, you know, fund and raise capital, that's not our community. And so we're
Right.
facing not only those, deterrents in terms of being our full selves in the workplace, we're also facing sheer violence. Like I was talking to this one Uber driver whose story still haunts me because he was living next door to someone who's dominant caste. This person found out that he was caste oppressed, and he started to call him nonstop, leave messages for them saying, I'm going to kill you. How dare you move here? You don't belong here. You need to be back home. And, and then starting to use all these slurs. He could not get remedy because like the police didn't understand the issue. He tried to file a restraining order. They didn't understand an issue. And he had to do this multiple times before he got a deterrent. But even then, he's an Uber driver and, he drives 3 hours to the place that he has to go do his work. And once he's there, he's also facing casteism from his clients.
Right.
And there's nothing that he can say or do. And he's like, I left back home to try to be able to make a better life, but I keep
Right.
seeing it asserted here.
Right.
So I feel like structural violence, discrimination, these are all things that hold marginalized communities back from getting their fullest economic development and options. Right. And I think about last year when I experienced that thing from Google, I had venture capitalists, people that are whose portfolios are worth $1 billion, asking for people to foment violence against me, saying that I was a terrorist, asking, the FBI and other institutions to investigate us for our civil rights work. And imagine I am just a DEI consultant and organizer that works on these issues. Imagine a worker having to face the financial might of those bigoted networks. That's just it's just unheard of, right?
Untenable. They can't do it.
But that's why we need to build shared mutual solidarities across all these civil rights movements and use the law. Because even though our democracy is fragile, we have amazing civil rights precedents because of the power of Black civil rights and other BIPOC civil rights movements. So that gives a threshold for so many other vulnerable communities and protected classes to build a foundation to get remedy. And that's what is so amazing about having this legal framework to build power.
I wish we had more time to continue this conversation, but they call it a chair chat for a reason. It's a chat. I want to ask you one last question. What would you say should be the role that lawyers generally, but specifically the American Bar Association, and then even more specifically, what can the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section be doing, or what should we be doing to advance your work, to partner with you? What would you say to us to collaborate?
Well, I think one core way right now is to really flank this caste equity civil rights movement by confirming that it's completely lawful to clarify existing protections that exist for caste oppressed people in the law, and encouraging as many institutions to add caste as a protected category. The mandate for this not just comes from our own racial history in terms of civil rights law, but covenants that we have ratified as the United States, like the International Convention Against Racism and Discrimination. But I think that, when we have bodies like the South Asian Bar Association, which has, thrown its support behind caste equity protections, and ABA flanking Dalit civil rights leaders and organizations, that provides a really clear legal, North Star in a time when there's a lot of bigoted disinformation aimed at deplatforming vulnerable workers and, vulnerable BIPOC electeds who are taking on this issue because they believe in safer workplaces and workplace protections for all workers.
Right.
So I think having the ABA come out on this issue and also providing technical support and training, especially thinking about CLEs related to caste equity, is crucial because many councils come to us for support as they're building their policies,
Right.
as they're thinking about, how do I conduct a workplace investigation on this issue?
Mhm.
And what are ways that I can think proactively about DEI? So we're not thinking about harm, we're thinking about how to create a welcoming place for all workers.
Right.
Those are places I think the ABA could really excel.
Wonderful. We will definitely follow up with you to do that work. And I apologize to you, but I lied. I have one more question.
Oh, okay then.
How can people find you? What are your social media handles, or how do we find your work?
Oh, so if people want to learn about the work of Equality Labs, you can find us on our website, equalitylabs.org, or on social media, where our handles on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram are at Equality Labs. And if you want to find me or my work around the trauma of caste, you can look me up at Dalit, DALIT, Diva, and I'm there on Instagram and Twitter as well.
Wonderful. Thenmozhi, thank you for your time today. You are a tremendous voice in advocating for the advancement of civil rights and social justice. You remind me of Dr. King's famous quote, "A threat to justice anywhere," I'm sorry, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And so I appreciate your work. We look forward to seeing you again and working with you in the very near future. Thank you all for listening to this week's edition of Chair Chat. Look forward to seeing you again next week. Take care.
Bye, everyone, and happy Dalit History Month.